My family accused me of ruining my father's 65th birthday party while I lay paralyzed on the cold marble floor of their foyer. My father raised his crystal whiskey glass, stepped over my struggling body, and called me pathetic in front of 50 wealthy guests. But 20 minutes later, the head paramedic would ask a single horrifying question that made my father's smug smile vanish and sent him collapsing into a chair. The answer to that question changed my entire life. I am Danielle, 35 years old, and a forensic accountant who spent years silently funding my family's lavish lifestyle. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat in a toxic family. Trust me, you will want to hear how I turned their ultimate betrayal into my ultimate freedom. I was gasping for air. The grand crystal chandelier above me splintered into fuzzy spikes of light as my airway rapidly swelled shut. I clutched my throat, my fingernails scraping my own skin, but the oxygen simply would not come. I had taken exactly one bite of the custom birthday cake my sister Ashley had handed me moments before. Now I was dying on the imported Italian tile I had quietly paid to have installed just last summer. My father Richard stood directly above me. He did not drop to his knees. He did not scream for help. Instead, he casually adjusted the cuffs of his tailored tuxedo, took a slow sip of his expensive bourbon, and looked down at me with absolute sheer disgust. He sighed loudly enough for the silent room of country club executives and local politicians to hear. "There goes Danielle," he announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "Throwing another childish tantrum because she cannot stand sharing the spotlight." He nudged my shoulder with his polished dress shoe. "Get up, Danielle. You are embarrassing yourself." I tried to speak, to tell him I needed the emergency medicine from my purse, but only a sickening wheeze escaped my lips. My vision was tunneling rapidly. Through the narrowing circle of light, I saw my mother Susan rushing over. For a split second, I felt a surge of hope. I thought my mother was coming to save me. But Susan did not reach for my hand to comfort me. She grabbed my designer purse from the console table and shoved it out of the way, hiding it behind a massive floral arrangement. "Stop ruining your sister's moment, Danielle," she hissed, her face twisted in bitter anger. "Your father just made a toast. We are celebrating. You always do this when the attention is not on you." I watched in absolute horror as my 32-year-old sister Ashley, the undeniable golden child of the family, stepped forward into my fading line of sight. Ashley was wearing a silk gown that I had paid for using my corporate credit card. She looked down at me, a smug, arrogant smirk playing on her perfectly painted lips. She deliberately stepped forward and kicked my fallen high heel across the foyer. It slid across the marble and hit the baseboard with a sharp, loud crack. "It is fine, Mom," Ashley said, rolling her eyes dramatically. "She is just acting out because Dad is giving me the Cape Cod house. Let her lay there on the floor until she gets over it." The Cape Cod house. The words echoed in my fading consciousness, burning worse than the lack of oxygen in my lungs. My father had just announced to the entire party that he was gifting the family vacation home to Ashley as a token of his appreciation for her baking his birthday cake. The bitter irony was absolutely suffocating. They were giving away a house that I had secretly paid the mortgage on for the last 6 years. I had covered the roof repairs, the property taxes, and the landscaping bills to save my father's pride when his bad investments nearly bankrupted them. They were happily gifting my hard-earned equity to the sister who had never held down a job for more than 6 months and who lived entirely off the allowance I secretly transferred to my parents' checking account. The wealthy guests murmured among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable, but no one intervened. In their elite circles, my parents had spent decades carefully painting me as the difficult, unstable daughter while propping Ashley up as the fragile, perfect angel. The false narrative was so deeply ingrained that even as my lips turned blue, 50 grown adults stood by and watched me suffocate, genuinely believing I was simply faking a medical emergency for attention. I felt my body going completely limp. The edges of my vision turned black. I was going to die right here, surrounded by people who viewed my death as an irritating inconvenience to their cocktail hour. Suddenly, a voice shattered the polite murmurs of the crowded foyer. It was loud, furious, and entirely out of place in my parents' carefully controlled environment. "Move out of the way right now." The voice belonged to Kendra, my 33-year-old sister-in-law. Kendra is an incredibly sharp African-American woman who had married my brother Ryan 3 years ago. From the very moment she joined the family, Kendra saw right through my parents' toxic dynamics. She was the only person who never treated me like a walking checkbook, and the only one who recognized the financial abuse I endured. Kendra shoved her way through the crowd of men in tuxedos, pushing my father aside so violently that his bourbon splashed onto the expensive floor. She dropped to her bare knees beside me, ruining her dress. Her hands immediately went to my neck, feeling my racing pulse and then touching my cold, sweating face. "She is in anaphylactic shock." Kendra screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with sheer terror. "Call emergency services right now. Somebody call an ambulance." My brother Ryan rushed forward, not to help his wife save my life, but to grab Kendra's arm and pull her away. "Kendra, stop making a scene," he whispered frantically, looking around at the staring, wealthy guests. "Mom and Dad said she is just having a panic attack. You are embarrassing the family. Calm down." Kendra ripped her arm away from Ryan with a look of pure lethal disgust. "She is turning blue, you spineless coward," Kendra roared, pulling out her own phone and dialing the emergency number herself. "She is having a severe allergic reaction. Where is her purse? Where is her emergency medicine?" Susan stepped in front of the console table, crossing her arms defensively. "We do not know where her purse is." Susan lied smoothly without missing a beat. "And we are not ruining this beautiful party for her silly theatrics." Kendra did not waste another single second arguing with my delusional mother. She barked our exact address to the medical dispatcher, demanding an ambulance with advanced life support immediately. Then she grabbed my hand, squeezing it with all her strength. "Hold on, Danielle." She kept repeating, her voice cracking with emotion. "Help is coming. Do not close your eyes. Look right at me. Please stay with me." But I could not hold on any longer. My lungs burned with a fiery agony. The last thing I heard before slipping into total darkness was the distant wail of sirens growing louder outside the mansion. When I briefly regained consciousness, I was no longer lying on the cold marble floor. I was strapped to a stretcher, being wheeled rapidly toward the grand double doors of my parents' home. The bright, flashing lights of the ambulance painted the walls of the foyer in harsh strokes of red and white. A paramedic was straddling me, forcing a breathing tube down my swollen throat to manually open my airway. The sharp pain was blinding, but it brought a sudden rush of much-needed oxygen into my starving lungs. The head paramedic, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern face, stopped the stretcher right in the doorway. He turned to face my father, who was still holding his empty crystal whiskey glass, though his face had grown pale at the sight of the heavy medical equipment. "Sir," the paramedic demanded, his voice cutting through the dead silent room like a heavy blade. "Why did you not use her emergency injector?" My father stammered, trying desperately to maintain his arrogant country club composure in front of his friends. "She was just being dramatic. She does this all the time to ruin our family events. It is just a little cake." The paramedic held up a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was the fancy dessert plate with the remaining piece of birthday cake I had eaten. "We found her medical bracelet." The paramedic continued, his tone dropping to a dangerous, furious level. "It clearly states she has a severe and highly lethal allergy to walnuts. This cake you served her is saturated with pure walnut oil. My team found the empty extract bottle hidden at the bottom of your kitchen trash can." The entire party gasped in unison. The mayor of our town, who was standing near the coat closet, physically took a step away from my mother. The paramedic took a threatening step closer to my father. "Did you intentionally poison your daughter?" My father stepped backward, his jaw dropping open. He looked at Susan, who had suddenly turned the color of ash. He looked at Ashley, who was now trembling uncontrollably, hiding behind Ryan. The crystal glass slipped from my father's sweaty hand, shattering into 100 pieces on the marble floor. He collapsed backward into a velvet chair, unable to form a single word of defense. Over the paramedic's shoulder, I saw a uniformed police officer step through the front door, his hand resting firmly on his radio. He looked at my father, then at the plastic evidence bag, then at my sister, who was now sobbing quietly. The officer began walking straight toward them. I wanted to stay awake to see their faces, as the heavy reality of their actions crashed down upon them, but my body had absolutely nothing left to give. The flashing red lights faded out. The sound of the police radio morphed into static white noise, and I completely lost consciousness, plunging back into the dark. The steady rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor was the first thing that anchored me back to reality. I slowly opened my eyes, fighting against the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit. My throat felt like it had been shredded with crushed glass, and heavy tubes connected my arms to a wall of medical machines. I turned my head, expecting to see my family anxiously waiting for me to wake up. Instead, the room was entirely empty, except for one person. Kendra was asleep in an uncomfortable plastic chair in the corner, her ruined dress from the party still stained with water and dirt. There were no flowers from my parents. There were no balloons or get-well cards from my brother or my sister. Just the sterile smell of bleach and the chilling realization of my own isolation. The heavy door to my hospital room swung open, hitting the wall with a loud thud. My mother, Susan, and my father, Richard, marched in. They did not rush to my bedside to hug me. They did not even ask if I was in pain. My father was clutching a brown plastic clipboard and looking around nervously, as if checking for listening devices. He shoved the clipboard onto my lap, right over my thin hospital blanket. "Sign this right now," Danielle, my father, demanded, tapping a silver pen against the plastic clip. "The police have been harassing us all morning. You need to sign this official statement confirming that the walnut oil was an accidental mix-up by the catering company." I stared at the paper. It was a drafted affidavit completely absolving my sister Ashley of any wrongdoing and shifting the entire blame onto a small local catering business. They wanted me to ruin an innocent business owner's life to protect the golden child from attempted manslaughter charges. I tried to speak, but my voice was barely a hoarse whisper. "She poisoned me." I rasped my chest, aching with the effort. "She put it in my specific slice." Susan rolled her eyes, crossing her arms in sheer annoyance. "Oh, do not be so dramatic, Danielle," she scoffed, adjusting her expensive pearl necklace. "Ashley is beside herself with guilt. It was an honest mistake. And frankly, you are being incredibly selfish. Do you have any idea how much the hospital parking structure charges per hour? We have been dealing with the police all night, and you are just making things worse. You owe us this favor. We paid for your college and raised you. We gave you everything." I felt a cold surge of absolute clarity wash over me. The remnants of whatever familial loyalty I had left completely evaporated. I looked my mother directly in the eyes. "You did not pay for my college," I whispered, my voice gaining a fraction of strength. "I took out student loans and worked 3 jobs, and the only reason you are not living on the street right now is because I secretly paid off your mortgage 5 years ago." Before Susan could recover from the shock of my statement, the door opened again. Ashley strolled into the intensive care unit, holding an iced coffee. She did not look like a woman overcome with guilt facing potential prison time. She looked perfectly rested, wearing a brand new designer tracksuit. She did not even glance at my medical monitors. Instead, she walked straight up to my bed and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. "This has been the most traumatizing 24 hours of my entire life," Ashley announced, centering herself as the ultimate victim. "Watching you collapse on the floor gave me severe post-traumatic stress disorder. I cannot even look at cake without getting a panic attack. My therapist says I need an immediate wellness retreat to process the trauma you put me through. So I am going to need your corporate black card, Danielle. The retreat requires a $10,000 deposit today." Kendra, who had woken up during the commotion, stood up from her chair in absolute disbelief. Are you out of your mind? Kendra yelled, pointing at Ashley. She is lying in a hospital bed with tubes in her arms because you tried to kill her and you are asking for her credit card. My brother Ryan peeked his head through the door, entirely too cowardly to fully enter the room. Come on, Kendra! Ryan whined from the hallway, rubbing the back of his neck. Just stay out of it. Ashley is really hurting right now. We all need to heal as a family. Just let Danielle sign the paper so we can go home. I slowly reached over to the bedside table with my unbruised arm and grabbed my cell phone. The screen illuminated my face. I ignored the clipboard sitting on my lap. I did not scream or cry. Being a forensic accountant meant I understood one universal truth better than anyone else in that room. Money is the ultimate leverage. And for the last decade, I had been the silent, invisible bank rolling their entire opulent lifestyle. They had mistaken my financial generosity for weakness. I opened my secure banking application. I navigated to the family trust accounts that I had foolishly set up to manage their debts and property taxes. With 3 simple taps of my thumb, I initiated a complete and total freeze on every single account. I revoked my father's access to the emergency funds. I canceled the secondary credit cards attached to my name. I locked down the estate accounts, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the cash in their physical wallets. I set my phone face down on the tray table. I looked up at Ashley, who was still holding out her hand, expecting me to hand over my physical credit card. Therapy is expensive, Ashley. I said, my voice raspy but dangerously steady. Good luck paying for it. Exactly 3 seconds later, Ashley's cell phone buzzed loudly in her pocket. She pulled it out, her annoyed expression shifting to sudden confusion. She stared at the screen. It was an automated fraud alert from her favorite luxury designer brand, notifying her that a $10,000 online charge for a limited edition handbag had just been violently declined. Her eyes widened in absolute panic as she realized the golden goose was finally dead. 2 days later, I was officially discharged from the hospital. The physical pain in my throat was slowly fading, but the absolute clarity in my mind was sharper than it had ever been in my entire life. I took a private car service back to my high-security luxury condominium complex in the downtown financial district. My parents did not call to check on me. My brother Ryan did not text to see if I made it home safely. The only person who showed up at my door was Kendra. Kendra arrived carrying 2 heavy bags of groceries and a container of homemade soup. She looked utterly exhausted, but her eyes were burning with an intense protective fury. She set the bags down on my granite kitchen island and turned to face me. Danielle, you need to call a lawyer right now. Kendra warned, her voice trembling slightly. I was at the family house grabbing some of Ryan's clothes when I overheard your father and Ashley talking in his home office. They are planning to petition the court to declare you medically incompetent. They want to claim that the lack of oxygen during your allergic reaction caused permanent brain damage, so they can gain full power of attorney over all your assets and unlock the frozen trust accounts. I did not panic. I did not cry. I simply walked over to my home office and booted up my highly encrypted laptop. My family had made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot that I was a senior forensic accountant for one of the top financial firms in the country. I spent my days dismantling complex offshore tax evasion schemes for multi-billion-dollar corporations. Unraveling my father's messy local finances was going to be absolute child's play. I logged into the master accounting software I used to monitor the family businesses. For years, I had blindly paid their bills to keep the peace without digging too deeply into their operational ledgers. That was my only mistake. Now I was looking at everything with a fine-toothed comb. It took me less than 3 hours to follow the digital paper trail. The financial web my father had spun was not just irresponsible, it was entirely illegal. Richard was the president of our Wealthy Neighborhoods Homeowners Association. It was an incredibly prestigious position he used to stroke his own massive ego and control the neighborhood. But looking at the bank transfers, I realized he was using it for much more than social status. Over the past 2 years, My father had systematically siphoned over $150,000 from the neighborhood repair fund. He was masking the theft by writing inflated invoices to a fake landscaping vendor that he created online. Then he was funneling that stolen cash directly into Ashley's failing luxury clothing boutique to make it look like she had actual paying customers. My sister was not just a spoiled brat. She was an active participant in a federal money laundering scheme. I downloaded every single ledger, every fake invoice, and every bank routing number. I printed them out on crisp white paper and placed them into a thick manila folder. My weapon was fully loaded. The very next morning, the intercom in my condo buzzed loudly. The security guard at the front desk nervously informed me that my parents were downstairs demanding to be let up. I told him to send them up. I unlocked my heavy steel front door and left it cracked open. I walked back to my kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of green tea, and waited for the show to begin. Richard and Susan barged into my home like they owned it. They were not alone. Trailing closely behind them was a slick-looking man in a cheap gray suit carrying a beaten-up leather briefcase. It was the shady strip mall lawyer my father used for his minor golf course disputes. My father marched straight into my dining room and slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto my glass table. "You leave us no choice, Danielle," Richard announced, using his loud, authoritative tone designed to intimidate me. "Your erratic behavior, freezing our accounts, and the severe brain hypoxia you suffered have clearly impaired your judgment. We are executing an emergency medical power of attorney. You are going to sign these papers transferring control of the family trust back to me so I can manage your care properly. If you refuse, we will bring the police up here and have you involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility for your own safety." Susan stood beside him, nodding in agreement, pretending to look deeply concerned. "You need professional help, sweetie," Susan added, her voice dripping with fake maternal sympathy. "Just sign the papers so we can take care of you. We are your family and we know what is best for your mental health." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my green tea. I did not look at my parents. I looked directly at the shady lawyer who was pulling a silver pen from his jacket pocket. I picked up the thick manila folder from the kitchen island and tossed it onto the glass table right on top of their ridiculous power of attorney documents. "I suggest you read that before you let your clients commit felony extortion in front of you," I said calmly. The lawyer looked confused, but he opened the folder. His eyes scanned the top page, which contained a perfectly mapped flowchart of the stolen Homeowners Association funds routing directly into Ashley's boutique bank account. I had highlighted the federal wire fraud and embezzlement statutes in bright yellow ink. The lawyer flipped to the second page containing the fake vendor invoices, then to the third page showing my father's direct digital signatures authorizing the illegal transfers. The color completely drained from the lawyer's face. He began to sweat profusely. He knew immediately that this was not a simple family dispute over a spoiled daughter's medical care. This was a completely documented slam-dunk federal indictment waiting to happen. Without saying a single word to my father, the lawyer dropped his silver pen onto the glass. He quickly snapped his leather briefcase shut, grabbed his coat, and power-walked straight out the front door. We could hear his dress shoes echoing rapidly down the hallway as he literally ran toward the elevators to escape the sinking ship. My father looked at the open front door in total shock, then turned his head slowly back to me. "What did you just show him?" Richard demanded, his authoritative voice cracking into a high-pitched squeak. I leaned forward, resting my hands heavily on the cold glass table. "I showed him the exact reason why you are going to leave my home right now," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "You have exactly 48 hours to replace the $150,000 you stole from your wealthy neighbor's dad. If that neighborhood repair account is not fully replenished by Friday morning, I will email the unredacted financial logs to every single person on the Homeowners Association Board and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Take your garbage legal papers and get out of my house." My father stood frozen in my dining room, his face flushed with a mixture of rage and absolute terror. He grabbed Susan by the arm and practically dragged her out of my condominium, the heavy steel door slamming shut behind them. I had given them 48 hours to fix their embezzlement mess, but instead of doing the right thing, the golden child decided to double down. Driven into a corner with her accounts completely frozen and no money to fund her lavish lifestyle, Ashley's audacity reached an entirely new level. She decided that if she could not physically control my money, she would destroy the professional source of it. The very next afternoon, I was sitting at my glass desk in my corner office, overlooking the financial district, when my desk phone rang. It was the Director of Human Resources demanding my immediate presence in the executive conference room. I walked in to find my firm's senior partners and the head of our legal department waiting for me with incredibly serious expressions. They hit play on a recorded voicemail. It was Ashley. She had called my firm's anonymous corporate ethics hotline, posing as a concerned whistleblower. She spun a wild, completely fabricated story claiming I was engaged in illegal insider trading and using offshore tax havens to hide illicit funds for my clients. It was a desperate, vicious attempt to get me fired and stripped of my professional accounting licenses. My bosses expected me to panic or break down crying. Instead, I calmly asked the legal director to connect my encrypted laptop to the conference room projector. I brought up my meticulously documented paper trails displaying every single perfectly legal, heavily audited transaction I had managed for the last 5 years. But I did not stop there. I pulled up a high-definition video file. I explained to my bosses that my sister had recently attempted to poison me and was now retaliating because I legally cut off her allowance. I played the security camera footage from my front door captured just a few hours prior. The video clearly showed Ashley screaming at my intercom, explicitly threatening to call my bosses and make up federal lies about me if I did not unfreeze her credit cards immediately. The conference room went dead silent. The head of legal sighed in sheer disbelief at my sister's profound stupidity. They informed me that not only was my job completely secure, but the firm's massive legal department was going to officially press charges against Ashley for corporate defamation and targeted harassment. By that evening, word of the impending corporate lawsuit had reached the rest of the family. The intercom in my condo buzzed again. This time it was my brother Ryan. I let him up. He stood in my doorway looking pathetic and exhausted, wringing his hands like a nervous child. He begged me to drop the corporate charges. "She is family, Danielle," Ryan whined, his voice cracking. "You are destroying us over a misunderstanding. She just made a mistake. Please just give Dad the Cape Cod house deed and drop the lawsuit so we can all go back to normal." Before I could even answer him, the door to my guest bedroom swung open. Kendra stepped out into the hallway. She had been staying with me to help me recover and ensure I was safe. Kendra walked right up to her husband, her expression colder than solid ice. She completely tore into him. She called him a spineless coward for defending an attempted murderer over his own sister who was fighting for her life just days ago. Then Kendra reached into her leather tote bag, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and slapped it right onto Ryan's chest. They were official divorce papers. Ryan stood there completely stunned, holding the envelope with shaking hands. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I looked at my brother and realized this was the absolute perfect moment to set my ultimate trap. I needed to gather all of them in one room to end this nightmare permanently. I pretended to sigh, letting my shoulders drop as if I was finally defeated by the pressure. "Fine," I said, putting on my best exhausted voice. "I will drop the corporate charges, and I will give Dad the deed to the Cape Cod house, but on one strict condition." Ryan looked up, his eyes wide, desperate for a lifeline to report back to our parents. "Tomorrow night, all of you are coming here for a formal reconciliation dinner." I instructed, my tone flat and uncompromising. "Mom, Dad, and Ashley. I will have a legal notary present in the room. We will sign the papers, transfer the real estate deed, and wash our hands of this entire mess forever. But if anyone is late, the deal is completely off." Ryan nodded eagerly, promising they would all be there in their best behavior. He turned and practically ran down the hallway, clutching his divorce papers like a physical shield. Kendra looked at me, raising a knowing eyebrow. She knew I was an expert at setting traps, and she knew I had zero intention of handing over a single dime to those parasites. "You are not really giving them that house, are you?" she asked. I smiled back, a genuine, confident smile for the first time in weeks. I told her that I was giving them exactly what they had earned. The next 24 hours were a blur of meticulous preparation. I ordered a beautiful custom cake from a high-end bakery. I printed out the exact real estate documents they so desperately wanted to see. But most importantly, I coordinated with the local police precinct. My family thought they had successfully bullied me into submission. They thought my temporary silence was a white flag of surrender. They had absolutely no idea they were walking straight into an ambush they would never recover from. At exactly 7 o'clock the following evening, the heavy brass knocker on my front door sounded. I smoothed down my tailored dress, took a deep, steadying breath, and opened the door. Richard, Susan, and Ashley stood in the hallway looking like they had just won the lottery. They were dressed to the nines. My father wore a custom navy suit. My mother was draped in expensive jewelry she had bought with my money, and Ashley was carrying a brand new designer handbag she clearly purchased on credit, assuming I was about to unlock her trust fund. They pushed past me without a word of greeting. They walked straight into my dining room, their eyes instantly locking onto the thick stack of legal documents resting at the center of my glass table. Standing quietly in the corner of the room were two tall men wearing conservative gray suits, holding leather portfolios. "Are those the notaries?" my father asked, aggressively pointing a finger toward the men. "Yes," I replied smoothly, taking my seat at the head of the table. "They are here to witness the official transfer of assets and ensure everything is handled exactly according to the law." My mother let out a haughty laugh and pulled out her chair. "Well, it is about time you came to your senses, Danielle. This whole little rebellion of yours has been exhausting. Next time you feel like throwing a tantrum, maybe do not freeze the accounts of the people who gave you life." Ashley sat down across from me, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered on her face. She reached out and patted the stack of legal documents. "I already called my interior designer," she bragged loudly. "We are completely gutting the Cape Cod house next week. Your taste in furniture was always so utterly depressing anyway." I did not react to their insults. I simply smiled and stood up. "Before we sign the paperwork," I said cheerfully, "I thought we should celebrate our newly repaired family bond." I brought out dessert. I walked into the kitchen and returned carrying a massive, beautifully decorated tiered cake on a silver platter. I set it down right in the middle of the table next to the legal documents. Ashley's face instantly lost all of its color. She shoved her chair back so violently it scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "What is that?" she stammered, her eyes wide with sudden panic. "Do not worry, Ashley," I said, cutting a large slice and sliding it onto a plate in front of her. "There is absolutely no walnut oil in this one. I actually bake my own cakes. You really cannot trust catering companies these days, can you? Especially when someone sneaks into their kitchen before a party." My father slammed his fist on the table, making the silverware jump. "What on earth are you talking about, Danielle? Stop playing games and give me the pen." I picked up the television remote resting next to my water glass. "Speaking of baking," I continued, my voice dropping into a cold, deadly calm, "I wanted to share a very special home video with all of you." I pressed the power button. The massive 75-inch television mounted on my dining room wall flashed to life. The screen displayed crisp, high-definition security camera footage. The timestamp in the corner clearly showed the date and time of my father's 65th birthday party. The camera angle was from the ceiling of the high-end catering kitchen my parents had rented for the event. On the massive screen, we watched a clear, perfect shot of Ashley sneaking into the empty kitchen. She looked over her shoulder nervously. Then she pulled a small plastic bottle out of her designer purse. We all watched in absolute silence as my sister systematically injected concentrated walnut oil directly into the single slice of cake that had been set aside for my dietary restrictions. My mother let out a piercing, horrified scream. "That is a fake!" she yelled, pointing a shaking finger at the television. "You hired someone to digitally alter that video. You are insane, Danielle." Ashley was hyperventilating, her hands gripping the edge of the glass table so tightly her knuckles were completely white. I did not say a word. I just let the video loop showing her committing attempted murder over and over again in stunning high definition. My father stood up, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Enough," he roared, attempting to salvage whatever control he thought he had left. "Turn that garbage off right now. You are going to hand over the deed to the Cape Cod house this exact second, or I am dragging you to court for forging digital evidence. Hand me the deed, Danielle, and we will sweep this entire mess under the rug like we always do." I reached into the center of the table, picked up the top document from the stack, and slid it across the glass toward him. "Here is the deed, Dad," I whispered, leaning forward. "Read it very carefully." Richard snatched the paper, his eyes darting frantically across the legal text. Suddenly, his breathing stopped. His jaw dropped open, and the paper began to tremble violently in his hands. He read the words again, rubbing his eyes, as if his vision was failing him. "What does it say, Richard?" my mother demanded, practically crawling over the table to see the document. My father looked up at me, his eyes hollow and completely defeated. "You sold it!" He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "I sold the Cape Cod house to a private commercial developer at 8 o'clock this morning. The cash has already been transferred to an offshore account completely under my name. The family trust is entirely empty. You own nothing. You have nothing." Ashley shrieked, completely losing her mind. "You cannot do that. That was my house. You stole my house." I stood up slowly and turned toward the two men in the gray suits, standing quietly in the corner. "Gentlemen," I said calmly, "I believe we are finished here." The two men stepped forward. They reached into their jacket pockets. But they did not pull out notary stamps or pens. They pulled out heavy silver police badges and let them hang from their necks. They were senior detectives from the local precinct, and they had been wearing hidden microphones recording every single threat and confession my family had just made. "Danielle, what is this?" my mother cried out, clutching her pearl necklace as the reality of the situation finally crashed down upon her. The lead detective stepped up to the table, pulling 3 thick folders from his portfolio. He dropped the first folder directly in front of Ashley. "Ashley, you are under arrest for aggravated assault and reckless endangerment," he stated, his voice booming with authority. "We have your video, we have the catering logs, and we have the empty bottle we recovered from the trash." He dropped the second folder in front of my father. "Richard, you are being indicted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud regarding the Homeowners Association funds. Your accounts have been seized by the federal government pending a full investigation." Then the detective dropped the final folder right into my mother's lap. "And Susan, this is a formal eviction notice. The house you currently live in has been owned by Danielle's limited liability company for the last 5 years. She is terminating your lease effectively immediately. You have exactly 30 days to vacate the premises before the sheriff's department physically removes your belongings." The sound of approaching police sirens began to wail in the distance, echoing loudly through the downtown streets and rising up toward my condo windows. My family had finally run out of other people's money to spend and other people's lives to ruin. The bill had come due, and the price was everything they had. The next morning, the hospital formally discharged me. The physical pain in my throat had finally subsided to a dull, manageable ache, but the heavy realization of my situation weighed on me like a physical blanket of lead. I did not call my parents to ask for a ride. I did not text my brother Ryan to see if he was available. I ordered a private black car service and watched the affluent tree-lined streets of my childhood neighborhood fade away through the tinted windows. I headed straight for my high-security luxury condominium located right in the heart of the downtown financial district. My building requires secure key fob access for the elevators and features a strict 24-hour security desk in the lobby. For the first time in my entire life, I realized I desperately needed that level of physical security to protect me from my own blood relatives. I walked into my quiet, immaculate condo. I dropped my overnight bag on the polished hardwood floor and sank heavily onto my living room sofa. The silence in the apartment was deafening. There were no frantic text messages from my mother demanding money for a sudden emergency. There were no unannounced visits from Ashley expecting me to fix whatever financial disaster she had created that week. By logging into my banking application and freezing the shared accounts from my hospital bed, I had effectively cut the main oxygen line to their extravagant lifestyle. But I knew the silence would not last. I was dealing with deeply entitled and highly desperate people. The intercom on my wall suddenly buzzed sharply, breaking the quiet. The concierge informed me that Kendra was downstairs asking to see me. I told him to let her up immediately. A few minutes later, Kendra walked through my heavy steel front door, carrying 2 large paper bags from my favorite local deli. She set them down on the granite kitchen island. She looked utterly exhausted, her shoulders slumped with fatigue, but her dark eyes were sharp and filled with a fierce, protective urgency. "I brought you some chicken soup," she said, pulling out the warm containers and setting them on the counter. "But I did not just come over here to check your vital signs, Danielle. We have a massive problem. I was at the family house this morning packing up some of Ryan's clothes so I can stay at a hotel. I walked past your father's home office, and the heavy oak door was slightly cracked open. I stopped when I heard Richard and Ashley on speakerphone with a man who sounded like a lawyer." Kendra paused, taking a deep, steadying breath before delivering the final blow. "They are terrified because you froze the trust funds. They cannot access the mortgage payment accounts or their secondary credit lines. So your father is planning to file an emergency petition in probate court by the end of the week. They want to officially declare you medically incompetent." Ashley explicitly told the lawyer that the lack of oxygen during your allergic reaction caused severe and permanent brain hypoxia. They are going to claim you are no longer in your right mind and secure a medical power of attorney to completely seize your assets. They want to lock you away in a care facility and take everything. I felt a cold, absolute chill run down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. The very last remaining shred of hope I had, that my family was simply misguided or acting out of temporary panic, completely vanished. They were not just toxic or greedy. They were actively conspiring to destroy my personal autonomy, my professional career, and my basic freedom. They were perfectly willing to have me declared legally insane and institutionalized, just to maintain their country club memberships and designer wardrobes. I did not cry. I did not throw anything across the room in a fit of panic. The deep sadness I had felt in the hospital instantly calcified into pure, calculated rage. I stood up from the sofa, walked right past the warm soup on the kitchen island, and went straight into my home office. I sat down at my glass desk and opened my highly encrypted work laptop. My family had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had completely forgotten who I was and what I did for a living. I am a senior forensic accountant. My entire professional career is built on dismantling complex financial fraud for multinational corporations. I spend my days hunting down hidden offshore accounts, tracking illicit wire transfers, and exposing high-level corporate embezzlement. I track missing millions for a living. Unraveling my father's messy local finances was going to be absolute child's play. For the past 10 years, I had simply paid my family's bills to keep the peace. I transferred massive funds into the family trust and let my father manage the daily household expenses because it was easier than fighting with his fragile ego. I had never actually audited them. That was my biggest mistake. But today, the blindfold came off permanently. I logged into the master accounting software with my administrative credentials. I began pulling 5 years of bank statements, tax returns, and credit card ledgers. I exported the raw data into massive spreadsheets, running complex pivot tables and algorithmic anomaly checks that identify unusual spending patterns. I started with my father's primary checking account. Richard has been the president of his affluent neighborhood's homeowners association for over a decade. He always bragged about the immense power and social status it gave him over his wealthy neighbors. But as I cross-referenced the association bank logs with his personal accounts, I noticed a glaring, deeply illegal discrepancy. There were consistent monthly transfers ranging from $5,000 to $8,000, quietly leaving the neighborhood repair fund. I dug deeper into the wire transfers to see exactly where the money was going. The funds were being paid out to a company called Apex Landscaping and Design. I opened a new browser tab and ran a comprehensive public records search on the business. It simply did not exist. There was no active website, no state business registration, no tax identification number, and no physical address. It was a completely fabricated shell company. My father had been systematically writing inflated fake invoices and siphoning neighborhood funds into a hidden secondary account that only he controlled. By my rapid calculations, he had stolen over $150,000 from the Homeowners Association over the last 2 years alone. But Richard was too smart to just leave the stolen money sitting in a secondary bank account. He needed a way to clean the cash and bring it back into the family ecosystem without raising red flags with the Internal Revenue Service. I traced the outgoing wire transfers from the fake landscaping account. Every single dollar was being funneled directly into Ashley's luxury clothing boutique downtown. Ashley's retail store was a notorious failure among our social circle. She barely had any actual foot traffic, and her inventory was always wildly overpriced. Yet her official business ledgers showed massive monthly profits from anonymous cash sales and vague generic consulting fees. My father was using his golden child's failing business as a front to launder the money he was embezzling from his neighbors. And Ashley was directly signing off on every single fraudulent deposit. They were both actively committing federal wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. I sat back in my leather desk chair, staring at the glowing screen in absolute disbelief. My father and sister wanted to declare me medically incompetent to steal my hard-earned money. Meanwhile, they were running a sophisticated criminal enterprise right under my nose. I connected my laptop to my high-speed laser printer. I spent the next 2 hours printing out every single fake invoice, every fraudulent bank transfer, and every direct digital signature linking my father and my sister to the stolen funds. I highlighted the federal statutes they had violated in bright yellow marker. I gathered the thick stack of warm papers and placed them carefully inside a heavy manila folder. I tapped the edges against my glass desk, making the stack perfectly neat. My family wanted a legal war. They wanted to push me into a corner and strip me of everything I had worked my entire life to build. But they had absolutely no idea that I was now holding a nuclear bomb. I closed my laptop, picked up the folder, and walked back into the kitchen. I looked at Kendra, who was watching me quietly from the counter. "They are coming for me," I told her, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. "Let them come." Kendra stared at the thick manila folder resting on the granite counter. She shook her head slowly, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and absolute disgust. "You are telling me your own father has been stealing from his neighbors and using your sister to wash the cash?" Kendra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, leaning against the kitchen island. "Yes," I replied. "And they have been doing it for at least 2 years right under my nose, but having this evidence is only half the battle. If they actually manage to get a corrupt probate judge to declare me medically incompetent tomorrow morning, they will gain legal control over this evidence and destroy it before the authorities ever see a single page." I walked back into my home office, the adrenaline completely erasing my physical exhaustion. I sat down at my glass desk and pulled my encrypted laptop closer. I needed to build an impenetrable financial fortress around my assets before my father could file his emergency court petition. I began by isolating the limited liability company that I had created to purchase my parents' primary residence. Years ago, I bought their massive colonial estate to save it from foreclosure, allowing them to live there rent-free while I quietly held the deed. I opened the property ledgers and initiated a deep forensic scan of the attached credit lines. My stomach dropped as a glaring red flag flashed across my screen. 3 months ago, someone had successfully applied for a massive $200,000 home equity line of credit against the property. I pulled up the digitized application forms. There, printed clearly at the bottom of the document, was my forged signature. Richard had used my social security number and falsified my income statements to borrow against a house he did not even own. He had notarized the documents himself using his expired notary stamp from his old real estate days. The sheer audacity of his crimes was staggering. I navigated over to Ashley's boutique financials to see exactly where this newly stolen credit had gone. My sister was not just laundering the homeowners association money, she was drowning in catastrophic commercial debt. Her luxury clothing store owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to overseas vendors. The home equity loan my father fraudulently secured in my name had been immediately wired to Ashley's creditors to keep her business from being seized by aggressive debt collectors. They were robbing Peter to pay Paul, and they were using my clean financial identity as their personal shield. Kendra walked into the office carrying 2 mugs of black coffee. She set one down next to my keyboard and looked at the complex spreadsheets glowing on my monitors. "How bad is it?" she asked, wrapping her hands around her warm mug. "It is a federal-level catastrophe," I answered, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "They have committed wire fraud, identity theft, bank fraud, and tax evasion. If they actually try to drag me into a courtroom to declare me brain damaged, I will trigger a federal investigation that will put both of them in a federal penitentiary for the next decade." But I knew I could not leave anything to chance. My father was a master manipulator who played golf with local judges and politicians. I needed to move my liquid assets entirely out of his geographical reach. I picked up my secure phone and dialed my private wealth management team located in a high-security banking facility in Zurich, Switzerland. Because of the time difference, my lead portfolio manager answered immediately. I gave him my biometric voice password and instructed him to immediately transfer every single dollar of my personal liquid wealth into heavily fortified offshore blind trusts. I established strict parameters dictating that the funds could only be accessed through my physical presence and a secondary biometric retina scan. I explicitly informed my banker that if any American court order crossed his desk claiming I was medically incompetent, he was to immediately freeze the trusts and contact my corporate legal team to contest the petition. Within 45 minutes, my entire financial empire was locked inside an impenetrable vault. If my father somehow managed to win his fraudulent court case, he would open my domestic bank accounts only to find absolute zero balances. The sun slowly began to rise over the city skyline, casting a cold, gray light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my condo. I had been awake all night, fueled entirely by adrenaline and righteous anger. I spent the last few hours organizing the printed evidence into 3 perfectly structured binders. I included executive summaries, highlighted bank routing numbers, and a detailed timeline of their criminal conspiracy. I was a professional forensic accountant, and I had just prepared the ultimate prosecution file against my own family. Kendra fell asleep on my living room sofa, her ruined dress from the party still draped over a chair. I took a quick hot shower, letting the scalding water wash away the sterile hospital smell that still clung to my skin. I changed into a sharp-tailored black suit. I brushed my hair back, securing it tightly. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The frightened, suffocating woman lying on the marble floor 2 days ago was completely gone. In her place was a woman who was finally ready to burn down the toxic foundation of her past. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a fresh cup of green tea. The digital clock on the stove read 8:30 in the morning. Right on schedule, the secure intercom on my wall let out a harsh, piercing buzz. The sound made Kendra jump awake from the sofa. She looked at me, her eyes wide with sudden alarm. I walked over to the panel and pressed the communication button. "Yes," I said, my voice perfectly calm. Ms. Danielle, the lobby concierge, spoke nervously through the speaker. "Your parents are down here in the lobby. They have a gentleman with them who says he is their legal counsel. They are demanding that I let them up to your floor immediately. They said it is a medical emergency. Send them up, I replied, releasing the button. Kendra stood up, smoothing down her clothes. Are you sure you want to let them in here alone? She asked, glancing toward the front door. We could call the police right now and hand over the binders. No, I said, carrying my teacup into the dining room. I want to look my father in the eyes when he realizes he has lost everything. I took the thickest evidence binder and placed it right in the center of my glass dining table. I unlocked my heavy steel front door, leaving it cracked open just a few inches. Then I took my seat at the head of the table, waiting for the elevator doors down the hall to open. Let the show begin. The heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor outside my condominium were loud and completely undisciplined. I sat perfectly still at the head of my glass dining table, my hands resting lightly on the cold surface. The heavy steel front door, which I had left cracked open, swung wide and hit the interior wall with a loud thud. My father marched into my home with the unearned confidence of a man who believed he owned the entire world. He was wearing his favorite navy blazer and his country club tie, projecting an image of absolute authority. My mother trailed closely behind him, dabbing at her dry eyes with a crumpled designer tissue, playing the role of the deeply distressed parent to perfection. Trailing behind both of them was a man who looked entirely out of place in my luxury high-security building. He wore a cheap, shiny gray suit that hung awkwardly off his shoulders and carried a scuffed synthetic leather briefcase. His hair was slicked back with far too much gel. This was clearly the legal muscle my father had scraped together on such short notice. My father did not greet me. He did not ask how I was feeling or if my throat was still in agonizing pain from the breathing tube. He walked straight up to the dining table and slammed a thick stack of stapled legal documents right onto the glass. Your little stunt locking the family accounts is over, Danielle, my father barked, pointing a commanding finger at my face. You are going to sign these papers right now and transfer full power of attorney back to me. My mother stepped forward, placing a hand over her heart. We are doing this because we love you, sweetie, she said, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. The doctors at the hospital told us about the severe oxygen deprivation you suffered during your little allergic reaction. You are experiencing brain hypoxia. You are not thinking clearly, and your erratic financial behavior proves it. We need to take over your medical and financial decisions before you completely ruin your own life. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or defend my mental capacity. Instead, I slowly reached for the delicate porcelain teapot resting near my elbow. I poured myself a fresh cup of hot green tea. The fragrant steam rose quietly in the tense air between us. I lifted the cup and took a slow, deliberate sip, maintaining absolute eye contact with my father over the rim. The lawyer in the cheap suit, clearly agitated by my lack of submission, cleared his throat loudly. He stepped forward, trying to puff out his chest to look more intimidating. Ms. Danielle, my name is Mr. Wallace. I represent your parents in this matter. Under state law, given your recent hospitalization and your sudden irrational freezing of the family trust, we have more than sufficient legal grounds to request an emergency medical conservatorship. If you refuse to sign these documents voluntarily right now, we will be forced to contact the authorities. We will have the police escort you to a psychiatric evaluation facility for a mandatory hold. He slapped a cheap plastic pen down on top of the documents. Sign the papers, he ordered. The sheer audacity of their plan was almost impressive. They were attempting to weaponize the very medical emergency they had caused to steal my life savings and cover up their own massive crimes. I set my teacup down on the saucer with a soft click. I did not look at my parents. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the lawyer. Mr. Wallace, I said, my voice smooth and perfectly calm. Are you a licensed attorney in this state, or did my father find your phone number written on the wall of a public transit station? The lawyer's face turned a dark shade of red. Listen here, little lady, he started, aggressively reaching into his briefcase. I am not playing games with a mentally unstable. I cut him off by sliding the thick, heavily redacted manila folder across the smooth glass table. It came to a stop right until it bumped against his cheap plastic pen. I highly suggest you read the contents of that exact folder before you allow your clients to commit felony extortion and medical fraud in front of me, I warned, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. My father scoffed, rolling his eyes. Do not look at that garbage, Wallace. She is just printing out fake spreadsheets to delay the inevitable. Sign the paper, Danielle, or I am calling the police right now. But Mr. Wallace was already opening the folder. His eyes dropped to the first page. It was the meticulously mapped financial flowchart I had created that morning. It showed the exact routing numbers from the Neighborhood Homeowners Association Repair Fund, transferring directly into the fake landscaping shell company my father had created. The second page showed the corresponding wire transfers moving that exact stolen money directly into Ashley's failing luxury boutique. I had used a bright red marker to highlight the specific federal statutes for wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement right at the top of the page. I looked directly at my father, who was now staring at the lawyer with growing impatience. You have exactly 48 hours to replace the $150,000 you stole from your wealthy neighbors, Dad. I announced, my voice echoing coldly off the high ceilings of my condo. If that neighborhood repair account is not fully replenished to the very last cent by Friday morning, the Homeowners Association Board gets the completely unredacted version of this file. And so does the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My mother's fake crying instantly stopped. The crumpled tissue fell from her hand, hitting the floor. What is she talking about, Richard? She whispered, her voice laced with sudden, genuine panic. Mr. Wallace flipped to the third page, which contained copies of the forged signatures on the fraudulent home equity line of credit. He was a cheap strip mall lawyer who probably made his living bullying small business owners, but he was not completely stupid. He recognized a massive, airtight federal indictment when he saw one. He knew instantly that my parents were not trying to protect a brain-damaged daughter. They were trying to hijack my clean financial identity to bury a massive criminal enterprise. He also knew that participating in this power of attorney scam would instantly get him disbarred and throw him straight into a federal penitentiary as a co-conspirator. The color completely drained from Mr. Wallace's face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a shiny gray suit. His hands were physically shaking as he gently closed the manila folder, pushing it back toward me as if the paper itself was radioactive. Wallace, what are you doing? My father demanded, grabbing the lawyer's shoulder. Make her sign the damn papers. Without saying a single word to my father, Mr. Wallace violently shrugged off his hand. He grabbed his cheap plastic pen from the table and threw it into his scuffed leather briefcase. He snapped the metal clasps shut with a loud, sharp click. He did not look at my father. He did not look at my mother. He turned around his head, ducked low, and briskly walked straight out of my dining room. We all stood in total silence, listening to his cheap dress shoes echoing rapidly down the hallway as he practically sprinted toward the elevators to escape the massive legal explosion he had almost stepped into. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind him, leaving my parents standing completely alone in my home, entirely defenseless. I picked up my teacup, taking another slow sip. The clock is ticking, Dad, I reminded him. 48 hours. After my parents and their cheap lawyer fled my condominium, I thought I had bought myself at least 2 days of absolute silence. I assumed my father would spend the next 48 hours frantically trying to liquidate his assets or begging his country club friends for loans to replace the neighborhood funds he had stolen. I underestimated the sheer reckless desperation of the golden child. With her credit cards declining, her luxury boutique drowning in massive debt, and my father completely failing to secure the medical power of attorney, Ashley was officially backed into a corner. She quickly realized she could no longer physically steal my money, so she decided to completely destroy my ability to make it. The next morning I woke up early. My throat was still tender, but my mind was incredibly sharp. I dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit, pulled my hair back into a severe bun, and ordered a private car to take me to the office. I am a senior partner track forensic accountant at one of the most prestigious financial auditing firms in the city. In my line of work, reputation is absolutely everything. We handle billion-dollar corporate mergers, investigate massive offshore tax evasion schemes, and testify as expert witnesses in federal court. Our clients trust us with their most sensitive financial secrets because our integrity is bulletproof. If an accountant at my firm is even suspected of unethical behavior, their career is instantly terminated. Ashley knew exactly how much my professional reputation meant to me. It was the armor I wore to survive our family. I walked through the towering glass doors of my corporate building, swiped my security badge at the front turnstiles, and rode the elevator to my corner office on the 40th floor. Everything seemed perfectly normal. I greeted my administrative assistant, ordered a black coffee, and sat down at my desk to begin my morning reviews. But when I typed my highly secure password into my computer terminal, a harsh red error message flashed across the screen. My network access had been completely revoked. I tried to open my corporate email account. It was locked. I picked up my desk phone to call the information technology department, assuming it was a routine server error. Before I could even dial the extension, my office door opened. It was my administrative assistant, looking incredibly pale and nervous. She quietly informed me that the director of human resources had just called. I was being summoned to the executive boardroom on the top floor immediately. A cold knot formed in my stomach, but I kept my face entirely impassive. I grabbed my leather portfolio and took the private executive elevator up to the top floor. I walked into the massive glass-walled conference room and realized instantly that this was not a routine meeting. Sitting around the long mahogany table was the managing partner of the firm, the director of human resources, and the head of our corporate legal department. They all looked incredibly grim. There were no polite greetings. There was no small talk about my recent hospitalization. "Please take a seat, Danielle," the managing partner said, gesturing to the empty leather chair at the opposite end of the long table. I sat down, placing my portfolio carefully in front of me. I looked at the three powerful executives waiting for someone to explain why my network access had been terminated. Late last night, our corporate ethics hotline received a highly disturbing anonymous phone call. The director of human resources began folding her hands tightly on the table. "As you know, we are legally obligated to take any whistleblower complaints extremely seriously, especially given the high-profile federal audits you are currently managing. The caller claimed to have intimate knowledge of your personal finances. They made severe allegations regarding illegal insider trading, offshore tax evasion, and the misappropriation of client funds." I stared at them, maintaining absolute composure. I did not gasp or act outraged. I simply asked them to play the recording. The head of legal pressed a button on a silver remote control. The high-tech audio system in the ceiling crackled to life. A voice echoed through the silent boardroom. It was muffled and clearly disguised using a cheap vocal distortion application, but the cadence, the dramatic pauses, and the arrogant tone were absolutely unmistakable. It was my sister Ashley. "I am calling to report a senior accountant at your firm," the distorted voice of my sister announced, dripping with fake concern. "Her name is Danielle. I cannot reveal my identity because I am terrified of her, but I have proof that she is engaged in massive financial crimes. She is using her corporate position to access confidential client portfolios and execute illegal insider trades. She has been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into hidden offshore accounts to avoid paying federal taxes. She even used stolen money to buy a massive luxury estate in the suburbs. You need to fire her and call the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission immediately before she ruins your entire company." The audio recording clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in the room. The executive stared at me, waiting for my reaction. The magnitude of my sister's lies was genuinely staggering. She had not just called to say I was a bad person. She had maliciously projected her own financial crimes and my father's active embezzlement right onto me. She accused me of buying the suburban estate with stolen money, when in reality I had used my own clean salary to save that exact house from foreclosure so she and my parents would not be homeless. She was trying to trigger a massive federal investigation into my life, hoping that the sheer weight of a corporate scandal would force me to resign and surrender my assets to my parents out of sheer panic. Danielle, the managing partner, said, his voice heavy with disappointment. These are federal allegations. If the Securities and Exchange Commission gets wind of this, our firm will be subjected to a catastrophic audit. We cannot have an active partner track accountant handling sensitive corporate data while under suspicion of insider trading. Effective immediately, we are placing you on an indefinite unpaid administrative leave. The head of legal slid a blank cardboard box across the polished mahogany table toward me. We are going to need your corporate laptop, your security badge, and your company cell phone, he instructed firmly. Our internal compliance team will be launching a full forensic investigation into all of your client accounts. You are not to contact any of your clients or your colleagues until this matter is entirely resolved. My sister had played her absolute best card. She had struck directly at the foundation of my independence. She thought that stripping me of my corporate identity would break me. She thought I would crumble in this boardroom, cry tears of panic, and beg for my job. She assumed I was as financially sloppy and easily intimidated as she was. But Ashley was an amateur playing a dangerous game against a seasoned professional. I did not reach for the cardboard box. I did not take off my security badge. I simply smiled, a cold, sharp smile that made the managing partner shift uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. I unzipped my leather portfolio and pulled out a sleek, encrypted digital drive. I set it on the mahogany table right next to the empty box. My sister wanted a corporate investigation. She was about to get one. I slid the sleek, encrypted digital drive across the smooth mahogany table, directly toward the head of the legal department. I told them that I did not need the blank cardboard box because I was not going anywhere. I instructed the legal director to plug the drive into the secure boardroom computer terminal and project the contents onto the massive wall monitor. The managing partner hesitated for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowed in confusion, but he nodded to the legal director. The older man picked up my drive and inserted it into the designated port. A highly organized dashboard immediately appeared on the high-definition screen, illuminating the dark conference room. I stood up from my leather chair, smoothing down my tailored suit jacket, and began my presentation. I looked directly at the Director of Human Resources and explained that the anonymous whistleblower who called the ethics hotline was not a concerned citizen or a corporate insider. I told them the caller was my 32-year-old sister, Ashley. I explained the context of her malicious phone call, detailing how my family had recently attempted to poison me during a birthday party to steal my real estate assets. I told the executives that when I survived the allergic reaction and subsequently froze their access to my personal wealth, my sister decided to retaliate by weaponizing this exact corporate ethics hotline against me. The Director of Human Resources looked highly skeptical, crossing her arms over her chest. She asked me how I could possibly prove the anonymous, distorted voice on the recorded phone call actually belonged to my sister. I did not argue with her or act defensive. I simply reached over and clicked on a specific video file labeled Front Door Security Camera. The massive screen shifted from my organized financial folders to a crystal-clear, high-definition recording taken just 2 days prior outside my downtown luxury condominium. The security video began to play loud and clear, filling the silent boardroom with the sound of my sister's shrill voice. The footage showed Ashley violently pounding her fists against my heavy steel front door. Her face was twisted in absolute rage, and her designer handbag was slipping off her shoulder as she kicked the bottom of the door. The high-tech microphone on my security system picked up every single word she screamed into the empty hallway. The executives watched in sheer stunned silence as my sister explicitly threatened to call my exact accounting firm. We all listened to Ashley lay out her entire fabricated plan in agonizing detail. She screamed at the closed door that she would tell my bosses I was executing illegal insider trades and hiding stolen money in offshore tax havens if I did not immediately unfreeze her credit cards. She even bragged to the camera that corporate human resources departments are so terrified of the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission that they would fire me on the spot before they even bothered to investigate the claims. The silence in the executive boardroom when the video ended was absolutely deafening. The managing partner took off his expensive reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long breath of sheer disbelief. The head of the corporate legal department actually let out a low whistle of astonishment, leaning back in his chair. The director of human resources looked completely mortified, her face turning a bright shade of crimson as she realized she had fallen for such a calculated and painfully obvious malicious trap. But I was not finished dismantling my sister's lies. I clicked on the next folder located on the encrypted digital drive. I told the board of directors that as a senior forensic accountant, I would never expect them to simply take my word for it, even with crystal clear video evidence. I opened a massive encrypted spreadsheet containing every single financial transaction I had executed over the last 7 years. I explained that I had hired an elite independent third-party auditing firm to conduct a comprehensive review of my personal and professional accounts the moment I realized my family was turning against me. I projected the certified independent audit onto the screen, proving that every single dollar to my name was perfectly legal, fully taxed, and completely detached from any corporate client funds. Then I opened the final folder to deliver the ultimate killing blow. I decided to show my bosses exactly why my sister was so utterly desperate for my money. I displayed the forged home equity line of credit my father had fraudulently taken out using my social security number. I showed the executives the fake landscaping invoices and the bank routing numbers proving my sister was actively laundering stolen neighborhood association funds through her failing retail clothing boutique. I explained that they were facing imminent federal indictment for multiple severe financial crimes, and their pathetic attempt to get me fired was a last-ditch effort to destroy my professional credibility before I could testify against them in a federal court of law. The managing partner leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the polished mahogany table. He looked at me not with corporate suspicion, but with profound professional awe. He apologized profusely on behalf of the entire accounting firm. He admitted that they had completely overreacted by demanding my badge and laptop, but he explained that strict federal financial regulations required them to take every anonymous tip seriously to protect their clients. I nodded gracefully, telling him I completely understood corporate compliance and would have expected nothing less from a top-tier financial institution. Then the head of the corporate legal department stood up. He was a ruthless veteran litigator who despised having his valuable time wasted by petty criminals. He looked at the paused security footage of Ashley screaming on the monitor, and his eyes narrowed into a dangerous predatory glare. He announced that my sister had just made a catastrophic, life-altering mistake. By calling the corporate ethics hotline and making false federal claims, she had not just attacked me personally. She had maliciously interfered with the daily operations of a multi-billion-dollar financial firm. She had forced senior executives to abandon their highly billable work to investigate a petty family dispute, and she had attempted to manipulate strict corporate policy for her own illegal financial gain. The legal director stated that the firm was not simply going to drop the internal investigation and move on. They were going to actively press severe charges against Ashley. He promised to unleash the entire weight of the corporate legal team upon her. He outlined his plan to file a massive civil lawsuit for corporate defamation, tortious interference, and targeted harassment. He explained with a cold, calculated smile that they would bury my sister in so much aggressive corporate litigation that she would never be able to afford a defense attorney for her impending criminal money laundering charges. The director of human resources immediately reached across the table and pulled the empty cardboard box far away from me. She assured me that my network access and email accounts would be fully restored before I even rode the elevator back down to my floor. The managing partner told me to take the rest of the week off with full pay to handle my personal affairs and ensure my physical safety. I thanked them all, packed up my encrypted digital drive, and confidently walked out of the boardroom. My sister had tried to strip away my professional armor to leave me defenseless, but instead she had just handed me an entire army of ruthless corporate lawyers. I rode the private executive elevator back down to my corner office, feeling a profound sense of absolute untouchable victory. My family had officially run out of moves. I returned to my luxury condominium that afternoon with a profound sense of clarity. The corporate legal team at my firm had moved faster than I could have ever anticipated. By the time I unlocked my heavy steel front door, my sister was already facing the full terrifying wrath of a multi-billion-dollar financial institution. I walked into my kitchen and found Kendra sitting at the granite island reviewing some consulting files on her laptop. I poured myself a glass of cold water and gave her a detailed recap of the executive boardroom meeting. When I told her that the head of the corporate legal department was personally filing a massive civil lawsuit against Ashley, Kendra actually cheered. For the first time in an entire week, the suffocating tension in my chest began to lift. But the momentary peace was completely shattered by the harsh buzz of the wall intercom. The lobby concierge informed me that my brother Ryan was downstairs. He was pacing nervously and demanding to be led up to my floor. I looked at Kendra. She slowly closed her laptop, her expression hardening into a mask of pure absolute resolve. I pressed the intercom button and told the concierge to send him up. A few minutes later, my heavy front door swung open. Ryan stood in the hallway looking absolutely pathetic. His shirt was wrinkled, there were dark, heavy bags under his eyes, and he was wringing his hands together like a frightened child. He stepped into my entryway and immediately launched into a frantic, desperate plea. "Danielle, you have to stop this madness right now," Ryan begged, his voice cracking with panic. "Corporate process servers just showed up at Ashley's boutique. They handed her a stack of lawsuits thicker than a phone book. She is completely hysterical. She is screaming that she is going to go to jail, and Dad is having a total meltdown because his country club friends are starting to ask questions about his neighborhood accounts. You are destroying us over a simple misunderstanding." I stared at my older brother, completely disgusted by his cowardice. "A simple misunderstanding," I repeated, my voice dangerously low. She injected a lethal amount of walnut oil into my birthday cake and left me to suffocate on the marble floor. She tried to frame me for federal insider trading. How exactly is any of that a simple misunderstanding, Ryan? He ran a trembling hand through his messy hair, avoiding my direct gaze. "She just made a mistake, Danielle. She was stressed about her business. You know how Dad pressures her. But she is family. You cannot just send your own sister to a federal penitentiary and bankrupt our parents. Please, Danielle. I am begging you. Just call your bosses and tell them you made it up. Drop the corporate charges, unfreeze the trust accounts, and just give Dad the deed to the Cape Cod house. If you just give them the house, they will leave you alone. We can go back to being a normal family." Before I could even formulate a response to his breathtaking sheer audacity, the door to my guest bedroom swung open. Kendra stepped out into the hallway. She had been quietly packing her belongings into a sleek leather duffel bag, but now she walked right up to her husband. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted. Ryan took a step backward, intimidated by the cold, lethal fury radiating from his own wife. "You are the most pathetic excuse for a man I have ever met in my entire life," Kendra stated, her voice perfectly level but cutting deeper than a serrated knife. "Your sister is standing right in front of you, recovering from a deliberate murder attempt. And instead of protecting her, you are standing in her home, demanding she reward her attacker with a vacation house, just so you do not have to deal with your parents whining." Kendra, Ryan stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "Please stay out of this. This is family business." Kendra let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You are absolutely right, Ryan. It is family business. And I am officially resigning from this toxic garbage dump of a family." She reached into her designer tote bag resting on the console table and pulled out a thick, crisp manila envelope. She slapped it directly onto Ryan's chest with so much force that he stumbled backward. Ryan instinctively grabbed the envelope, looking down at it in total confusion. "Those are official divorce papers," Kendra announced, crossing her arms over her chest. "I had my attorney draft them yesterday morning. I refuse to spend another single day married to a spineless coward who defends abusers and enables attempted murderers. I am going back to my apartment. Do not call me. Do not text me. You can speak directly to my lawyer from now on. Ryan stood frozen in the entryway, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked at the divorce papers in his trembling hands, and then looked back at his wife, his eyes welling up with tears. He had spent his entire life trying to keep the peace by appeasing his toxic parents, and now it had cost him the only good thing he had ever managed to achieve on his own. I looked at my broken brother and realized this was the absolute perfect moment to spring my ultimate trap. I needed to gather my father, my mother, and my sister in one single room to end this nightmare permanently. They needed to believe they had finally won. I let my shoulders drop, pretending to look completely defeated by the emotional exhaustion of the situation. I let out a long, heavy sigh and rubbed my temples, acting as if Ryan's pleading and the sudden divorce had finally broken my resolve. "Fine, Ryan," I whispered, putting on my absolute best exhausted voice. "You win. I cannot fight all of you anymore. It is tearing this family apart." Ryan looked up, his tear-filled eyes suddenly wide with desperate hope. "Really," he gasped, clutching the manila envelope. "You will drop the corporate lawsuits. I will call my bosses and drop the charges." I lied smoothly. "And I will sign the Cape Cod real estate deed completely over to Dad. But on one very strict condition. I am not doing this over the phone, and I am not dealing with your cheap strip mall lawyers." "Anything," Danielle. Ryan agreed, frantically nodding his head. "Just tell me what you need. Tomorrow night, all of you are coming here to my condo for a formal reconciliation dinner." I instructed, my tone flat and uncompromising. "Mom, Dad, and Ashley. I want everyone sitting at my dining table. I will have a licensed legal notary present in the room. We will sign the trust papers, we will transfer the real estate deed, and we will wash our hands of this entire miserable mess forever. But you tell them this, Ryan. If anyone is late or if anyone raises their voice in my home, the deal is completely off, and I will let the corporate lawyers tear Ashley apart." Ryan practically sagged against the doorframe, weak with immense relief. He promised they would all be there on their absolute best behavior. He thanked me profusely, completely blind to the fact that he was thanking me for orchestrating their total destruction. He turned around and scrambled down the hallway, clutching his divorce papers like a physical shield against the reality of his ruined life. The heavy steel door clicked shut. The condo was perfectly quiet again. I turned to look at Kendra. She was no longer glaring. A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face. "You are not actually giving them that vacation house, are you?" Kendra asked, raising a knowing eyebrow. I smiled back, feeling a rush of cold, pure adrenaline flooding my veins. "I am giving them exactly what they deserve," I told her. I walked back into my home office and picked up my secure phone. I did not call a legal notary. I called the lead police detective handling my poisoning case. I told him that if he wanted a full-taped confession from my sister and a federal wire fraud admission from my father, he needed to bring an undercover partner to my condo tomorrow night at exactly 7 o'clock. My family thought they had successfully bullied me into total submission. They thought my temporary exhaustion was a white flag of surrender. They had absolutely no idea they were walking blindly into an ambush from which they would never, ever return. The next evening arrived with a heavy, suffocating anticipation. At exactly 6:30, the intercom buzzed. It was not my family. It was Detective Miller, the lead investigator on my poisoning case, accompanied by a tall, broad-shouldered, plainclothes officer. They stepped into my condominium, wearing conservative gray suits carrying identical leather portfolios. They looked exactly like high-end corporate legal notaries. I briefed them on the exact layout of the room and the sequence of events I had planned. Detective Miller placed a small digital recording device under the centerpiece of my glass dining table. He and his partner then took their positions, standing quietly in the shadows near the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city skyline. At precisely 7 o'clock, the heavy brass knocker on my front door sounded. I smoothed down my tailored black dress, took a deep, steadying breath, and opened the door. Richard, Susan, and Ashley stood in the hallway. They did not look like a family coming to make peace with a daughter they had recently pushed to the brink of death. They looked like royalty arriving to collect taxes from a conquered peasant. They were dressed to the nines. My father wore a custom-tailored navy blazer and his favorite silk country club tie. My mother was draped in a heavy cashmere wrap and wore an expensive pearl necklace she had undoubtedly purchased using the allowance I used to provide. Ashley stood front and center wearing a brand new designer dress, holding a luxury handbag she had somehow managed to procure despite her frozen credit cards. Ryan stood at the very back of the group, looking pale and entirely defeated, his eyes darting nervously down the hallway. They did not offer a single word of greeting. They did not ask how I was feeling or apologize for the horrific events of the past week. My father simply pushed past me, stepping into my entryway, as if he held the deed to my entire building. Susan and Ashley followed immediately behind him, their expensive perfume filling the air and instantly souring the atmosphere of my home. "Well, it is certainly a bit sterile in here, is it not?" Susan commented loudly, her eyes scanning my meticulously clean living room. She ran a critical finger over the edge of my console table, checking for non-existent dust. "You always did have such a cold, depressing taste in decor, Danielle. It completely lacks the warmth of a real family home. But I suppose that makes sense given your personality." I closed the heavy steel door behind them, locking the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. I did not respond to my mother's petty insult. I simply gestured toward the dining room where the massive glass table was set. My father marched straight into the dining room, his eyes instantly locking onto the thick stack of legal documents resting precisely in the center of the table. He practically salivated at the sight of the crisp white paper. He stopped and looked at the two men standing quietly in the corner of the room. "Are those the notaries?" Richard asked aggressively, pointing a demanding finger toward the detectives. "Yes," I replied smoothly, walking past him and taking my seat at the head of the table. "They are here to witness the official transfer of assets and ensure everything is handled exactly according to the strict letter of the law." My father let out a haughty, triumphant laugh and pulled out his chair, sitting down heavily. "Well, it is about time you finally came to your senses, Danielle. This whole little rebellion of yours has been utterly exhausting for all of us. Next time you feel like throwing a childish tantrum, maybe do not freeze the bank accounts of the people who gave you life and put a roof over your head." Susan took the seat next to him, nodding in smug agreement. "We are willing to forgive your little outburst, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with fake, condescending maternal sympathy. "We know the lack of oxygen during your allergy attack made you confused and emotional. We are just glad you realized that family comes first, and you are finally ready to do the right thing." Ashley sat down directly across from me, a sickeningly sweet, victorious smile plastered across her perfectly contoured face. She reached out and patted the stack of legal documents with her manicured hand, acting as if the papers were already hers. "I already called my interior designer this morning," Ashley bragged loudly, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "We are completely gutting the Cape Cod house next week. I am tearing out those horrible dark cabinets you installed in the kitchen. They were so depressing. I am bringing in white marble and a massive center island. It is going to be a gorgeous summer retreat for me and my friends." The sheer, unadulterated delusion radiating from my sister was almost physically staggering. She was standing on the absolute edge of a federal prison sentence for money laundering and attempted murder. Yet she was sitting in my dining room bragging about renovating a house she did not even own. I looked at Ryan, who had quietly taken a seat at the far end of the table. He kept his head down, staring intensely at his empty water glass, completely terrified to make eye contact with me. He had delivered his toxic family right into the trap just as I had instructed. I remained perfectly calm. I did not raise my voice or react to their relentless stream of insults. I played the role of the defeated, submissive daughter flawlessly. I let them puff out their chests and assert their pathetic dominance. I let them believe they had successfully bullied me into surrendering my hard-earned wealth. They needed to feel completely invincible right up until the exact second the floor collapsed beneath them. "Let us just get this over with," Richard commanded, snapping his fingers in the air toward the detectives. "You boys bring the pens over here. I have an early tea time tomorrow, and I do not want to spend my entire evening sitting in this freezing apartment. Hand me the deed, Danielle, so we can sign the papers and put this ridiculous nightmare behind us." I smiled, folding my hands neatly on the glass table. "We will sign everything in just a moment, Dad," I said, my voice soft and accommodating. "But before we get to the legal paperwork, I thought we should celebrate our newly repaired family bond. After all, tonight is about putting the past behind us." I brought out a very special dessert for the occasion. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. The detectives in the corner did not move a single muscle, their faces completely unreadable. My parents exchanged a smug, victorious look, believing my offer of dessert was my final pathetic attempt to buy back their affection. Ashley rolled her eyes, pulling out her phone to start browsing expensive furniture websites. I walked into my kitchen, the cold marble floor cool beneath my heels. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out a massive, beautifully decorated tiered cake on a heavy silver platter. It was time to peel back the very first layer of the onion and watch them break. I carried the heavy silver platter back into the dining room and set it gently in the center of the glass table, right next to the stack of legal documents my father was so desperate to sign. It was a massive three-tiered vanilla bean cake covered in flawless white fondant and delicate hand-spun sugar flowers. It looked exactly like the expensive designer cake they had served at my father's 65th birthday party. The resemblance was uncanny down to the silver piping along the edges. The moment the platter touched the glass, Ashley's face instantly lost all of its color. The smug, arrogant smirk she had been wearing since she walked through my front door completely vanished. She pushed her chair back so violently that the wooden legs shrieked against my polished hardwood floor. She stared at the cake as if I had just placed a ticking time bomb directly on the dining table. "What is that?" Ashley stammered, her eyes wide with sudden genuine panic. Her manicured hands grabbed the edge of the table, bracing herself as if she was preparing to run out the front door. I picked up a heavy silver cake knife and smoothly cut a large, precise piece. I slid the thick slice onto a delicate porcelain plate. I pushed the plate directly across the glass until it stopped right in front of my sister. "Do not worry, Ashley." I smiled, my voice entirely pleasant and conversational. "There is absolutely no walnut oil in this one. I actually bake my own cakes from scratch. You really cannot trust catering companies these days, can you? Especially when someone sneaks into their private commercial kitchen right before a major party and compromises the food." My father slammed his heavy fist onto the dining table, making the crystal water glasses jump and clatter loudly. "What on earth are you talking about, Danielle?" he demanded, his face flushing with immediate anger. "Stop playing these ridiculous childish games and give me the pen so we can sign the paperwork. I am not going to sit here and listen to your paranoid delusions." I completely ignored his outburst. I walked over to the console table and picked up the black television remote, resting next to a vase of fresh white lilies. "Speaking of baking," I continued, my voice dropping into a cold, deadly calm that immediately sucked all the air out of the room. "I wanted to share a very special home video with all of you before we finalize any legal agreements tonight. I think it will really clear the air and help us move forward as a family." I aimed the remote and pressed the power button. The massive 75-inch television mounted on my dining room wall immediately flashed to life, illuminating the dark room with a bright, piercing glow. The screen displayed crisp, high-definition security camera footage. The digital timestamp glowing bright white in the bottom right corner clearly showed the exact date and the exact time of my father's 65th birthday party. The camera angle was positioned directly from the ceiling of the high-end catering kitchen my parents had rented for the event. The owner of the catering company had gladly handed over the footage when he realized my family was trying to frame his small business for criminal negligence. On the massive screen, we all watched a clear, perfect shot of Ashley sneaking into the empty stainless steel kitchen. The high-definition 4K camera captured every single detail of her designer silk gown and her nervous, shifting eyes. We watched her look over her shoulder multiple times to ensure the catering staff was completely gone and the hallway was empty. Then she reached into her expensive luxury handbag and pulled out a small, clear plastic bottle. The dining room was dead silent. Even my father had stopped breathing. The only sound was the soft hum of the television speakers and Ryan's ragged, terrified breathing from the far end of the table. We watched in absolute agonizing detail as my sister systematically unscrewed the cap of the bottle. We watched her walk directly over to the separate tray, holding my designated dessert. She injected the concentrated walnut oil directly into the single slice of cake that had been set aside for my specific severe dietary restrictions. We watched her carefully smooth over the vanilla frosting with her finger to completely hide the puncture mark. We watched her drop the empty plastic extract bottle directly into the bottom of the silver kitchen trash can before rushing out the swinging doors to rejoin the party and watch me suffocate. The video looped automatically starting from the very beginning. Ashley sneaking into the room. Ashley pulling out the lethal bottle. Ashley committing premeditated attempted murder. My mother let out a piercing, horrified scream that echoed violently off the high ceilings of my condominium. She pointed a shaking, jewel-covered finger at the television screen, completely refusing to process the reality of what she was seeing. "That is a fake!" Susan yelled, her voice cracking with pure hysterical denial. "You hired someone to digitally alter that video. It is a deepfake. You are completely insane, Danielle. You are trying to frame your own sister out of pure jealousy. You have always been jealous of her." Ashley was hyperventilating now. Her chest heaved rapidly and her hands gripped the edge of the glass table so tightly her knuckles were completely white. She could not tear her eyes away from the massive screen, watching herself commit a major violent felony over and over again in stunning clarity. She tried to speak, but only a pathetic whining sound escaped her throat. "Richard! Richard, do something!" Susan shrieked, grabbing my father's custom-tailored arm and shaking him frantically. "Tell them it is fake. Tell those two notaries in the corner that Danielle is manufacturing digital evidence to steal our property. Make her turn it off." My father stood up his chair, tipping backward and crashing heavily onto the floor. His face had turned a dangerous, explosive shade of purple. The confident, arrogant posture he had walked in with was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, destructive rage of a cornered animal realizing the trap had just snapped shut. "Turn that garbage off right now!" Richard roared, taking a threatening step toward me. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. "You are going to hand over the deed to the Cape Cod house this exact second, or I am dragging you to federal court for forging digital evidence and extortion. You think a fake video is going to stop me? Hand me the deed, Danielle, and we will sweep this entire disgusting mess under the rug like we always do. Give me the deed." I did not back away from his pointed finger. I did not show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. I simply reached into the center of the table, picked up the top legal document from the thick stack he had been practically drooling over all evening, and slid it across the smooth glass directly toward him. I smiled, looking him dead in the eyes. I told him exactly what he wanted to hear. "Here is the deed, Dad," I whispered, leaning forward so he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "Read it very carefully before you try to sign anything." My father snatched the crisp white paper from the table, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. He expected to see a transfer of ownership, putting the $1 million vacation home back into his greedy hands so he could sell it to pay back his stolen neighborhood funds. Instead, the words printed on the page hit him like a physical freight train. Suddenly, his heavy, enraged breathing completely stopped. His jaw dropped open and the paper began to tremble violently in his hands. He read the words again, rubbing his eyes as if his vision was failing him. The room fell into a suffocating silence as the reality of the document slowly paralyzed him from the inside out. "What does it say, Richard?" My mother demanded, practically crawling over the glass table to see the document. "Tell me what it says." He did not answer her. He just stood there frozen, holding the paper while the high-definition security video of his golden child committing attempted murder continued to play silently behind him, illuminating his pale, horrified face. The very first layer of the onion had been completely peeled away, exposing the rotting core of our family, and I had not even reached the best part. Richard stared at the crisp white paper, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He read the legal text over and over again, unable to comprehend the words printed on the page. His hands were shaking so violently that the heavy parchment paper rattled in the dead, silent room. Susan grabbed his custom-tailored arm, shaking him frantically. "Tell me what it says, Richard!" she demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. "Tell me she is lying!" He looked up at my mother, his face completely hollow. All the arrogant color had drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking incredibly old and fragile. "She sold it." He choked out his voice, barely a whisper. "She sold the Cape Cod house." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest, and watched the total devastation wash over them. "I sold it to a private commercial real estate developer at exactly 8 o'clock this morning." I clarified, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "The cash has already been transferred to a highly secure offshore account, completely under my name. The family trust you thought you controlled is officially empty. You own nothing. You have absolutely nothing to sell to pay back your stolen neighborhood funds." Ashley shrieked, slamming her manicured hands onto the glass table. "You cannot do that! That was my house! You stole my summer house, you psycho!" "I already hired an interior designer. What am I supposed to tell my friends?" Richard suddenly turned toward the two men in the gray suits standing quietly in the corner of my dining room. He pointed a desperate, trembling finger at them. "You see this!" he yelled, spit flying from his lips. "You are notaries. You are officers of the court. You just witnessed her admit to stealing family assets while under severe mental distress. I want you to draft a formal legal statement right now. She is completely insane." I stood up slowly, smoothing down my tailored black dress. "Gentlemen," I said, addressing the two men without taking my eyes off my father, "I believe we are completely finished here." The two men stepped out of the shadows. They reached into their tailored suit jackets, but they did not pull out notary stamps or legal pens. They pulled out heavy silver police badges and let them hang prominently around their necks. They were senior detectives from the local police precinct, and they had been wearing hidden microphones recording every single threat, extortion attempt, and confession my family had just made in my dining room. My mother's fake crying instantly stopped. She clutched her expensive pearl necklace as the reality of the situation finally crashed down upon her. "Danielle, what is this?" she cried out, her eyes darting frantically between the silver badges and my completely emotionless face. Detective Miller, the lead investigator on my poisoning case, stepped right up to the glass table. He unzipped his leather portfolio and pulled out 3 thick manila folders. He dropped the first folder directly in front of my sister. "Ashley, you are under formal arrest for aggravated assault and reckless endangerment," he stated, his voice booming with absolute, unyielding authority. "We have your video, we have the catering logs, and we have the empty walnut oil bottle we recovered from the trash. You are facing decades in a state penitentiary." Ashley let out a guttural sound of pure terror. She scrambled backward, knocking her dining chair over, but the second detective immediately stepped behind her, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder to block her escape path. Ashley instantly turned on her own blood. "It was not my idea," she screamed, pointing frantically at my parents. "Mom told me to do it. Mom said if Danielle was out of the way, we would get all the money. I am the victim here." Susan gasped, pressing a hand over her mouth. "How dare you, Ashley!" she shrieked, throwing her golden child directly under the bus to save herself. I never told you to poison her. You acted completely alone. Detective Miller completely ignored their pathetic infighting. He dropped the second folder right in front of my father. The heavy thud made Richard physically jump in his seat. Richard, you are being officially indicted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering regarding the Homeowners Association funds. Your personal bank accounts have already been seized by the federal government, pending a full criminal investigation. My father collapsed back into his chair, clutching his chest as if he had just been physically shot. He looked at the folder, then at the detective trying desperately to salvage his country club reputation. It is a misunderstanding. Richard stammered, his authoritative voice completely broken. It was just a temporary loan. I was going to put the money back. I am the president of the board. You cannot do this to me. I know the mayor. The mayor is the one who expedited your federal arrest warrant, Richard the detective replied coldly. Then Detective Miller dropped the final folder right into my mother's lap. And Susan, he continued, his tone flat and entirely professional. This is a formal legal eviction notice. The colonial estate you currently live in has been owned by Danielle's limited liability company for the last 5 years. She is terminating your lease effectively immediately. You have exactly 30 days to pack up and vacate the premises before the county sheriff's department physically removes you and your belongings from the property. Susan stared at the eviction notice in absolute disbelief. The massive house she used to host her elite social club meetings, the house she constantly used to make me feel small and unwelcome, was actually mine, and she was being thrown out onto the street. You cannot do this to us, Danielle. She sobbed, genuine tears finally streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. We are your family. We raised you. All of my friends will see the police throwing my furniture onto the lawn. I will be completely ruined. At the far end of the table, my brother Ryan slowly stood up, trying to quietly sneak toward the front door while the chaos unfolded. The second detective pointed a stern finger at him. Sit back down, Ryan, the detective ordered. You are not under arrest tonight, but you are a material witness to a federal financial crime and an attempted homicide. You are not leaving this city. Ryan sank back into his chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, sobbing quietly as his entire life completely disintegrated around him. I looked down at the 3 people sitting at my glass table. They were completely broken, stripped of all their false power, their stolen money, and their arrogant pride. You stopped being my family the moment you watched me suffocating on the floor and decided my life was worth less than a vacation house, I told them, my voice completely devoid of any pity or hesitation. You wanted a legal war over my assets, and you got exactly what you asked for. Right on cue, the distinct piercing sound of approaching police sirens began to wail in the distance. The sound echoed loudly through the dark downtown streets, rising up toward my condo windows and growing steadily louder by the second. Red and blue lights began to reflect off the glass buildings outside, signaling the arrival of the patrol units coming to take them away. My family had finally run out of other people's money to spend and other people's lives to ruin. The bill had come due, and the absolute final price was everything they had. The red and blue emergency lights, reflecting against my floor-to-ceiling windows, finally shattered the paralyzing spell that had kept my family frozen in their seats. The sheer volume of the approaching police sirens rising up from the downtown streets broke through their country club delusions and forced them to face the absolute reality of the moment. The heavy brass knocker on my front door sounded again this time, accompanied by the loud, authoritative voice of uniformed patrol officers announcing their presence in the hallway. Detective Miller did not wait for my parents to process the situation. He reached around to his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clink was the loudest sound in the entire dining room, cutting straight through the wailing sirens outside. He stepped directly behind my sister's chair. "Ashley, stand up and place your hands behind your back," the detective instructed, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. Ashley completely lost her mind. The smug, arrogant woman who had bragged about gutting my real estate property just 10 minutes prior instantly regressed into a terrified, screaming toddler. She threw herself backward against the chair, violently shaking her head. "No! You cannot touch me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Mom, tell them they cannot touch me. I am wearing designer silk. You are going to ruin my dress." The second detective moved in with practiced, ruthless efficiency. He grabbed Ashley's wrists, pulling her up from the chair. She kicked wildly, her expensive high heels scraping against my polished hardwood floor. She thrashed her arms, knocking her delicate porcelain cake plate off the glass table. It shattered into dozens of pieces, scattering vanilla cake and white frosting everywhere. "I did not do it," Ashley screamed at the top of her lungs, struggling against the detective's iron grip. "Danielle forced me to do it. She is a psychopath. She set me up to steal my business. I am the victim here." Her pathetic lies did not slow the detectives down for a single second. They expertly pinned her arms behind her back, and the steel cuffs clicked shut around her wrists with a heavy finality. Seeing his golden child forcefully placed in irons completely broke whatever remaining facade of dignity my father possessed. His self-preservation instinct entirely overrode his arrogant pride. Richard dropped his federal indictment folder onto the floor, spun around, and actually tried to sprint toward my heavy steel front door. It was an incredibly pathetic sight. He was a 65-year-old man who spent his weekends riding a golf cart, and he was attempting to outrun two seasoned police detectives in a closed apartment. "I need to call my golf partner," Richard yelled, his face flushed with panic. "He is a federal judge. He will have all of your badges for this. He never even made it past the kitchen island." The second detective abandoned Ashley for a split second, stepping squarely into my father's path. Richard slammed into the detective like a bird hitting a solid glass window. The officer did not even flinch. He grabbed my father by the lapels of his custom-tailored navy blazer, spun him around, and slammed him face first against the heavy steel front door. "Richard, you are actively resisting a federal arrest," the detective barked, pulling out a second pair of handcuffs. "Stop fighting, or I will add assaulting an officer to your massive list of charges." My father immediately crumpled. The fight instantly left his body, replaced by sheer, overwhelming cowardice. The handcuffs snapped tight around his wrists, pinning his arms awkwardly behind his back. Richard began sobbing, his cheek pressed completely flat against the cold metal door. He was blubbering incoherently about his pristine reputation, his country club membership, and how the local mayor was going to ruin my life for doing this to him. With her husband pinned against the front door like a common criminal, and her golden child screaming obscenities in steel bracelets, Susan realized she was completely out of options. She could not buy her way out of this room. She could not manipulate the police officers with her usual fake maternal charm. Her entire world was collapsing, and she had absolutely zero control, so she played the very last card she had in her toxic playbook. She resorted to extreme medical victimhood. Susan looked at me, her eyes filled with absolute venom, and then she let out a loud theatrical gasp. She clutched her expensive pearl necklace, her eyes rolling dramatically back into her head. "My heart." Susan wailed, her voice projecting across the room like a terrible stage actress in a cheap play. "I cannot breathe. The stress of this betrayal is killing me." She dramatically collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, ensuring she landed in a clear open space where everyone could see her. But she did not just pretend to faint. She actively began to mimic the exact physical symptoms I had suffered during my severe allergic reaction just a week prior. It was a sick, twisted mockery of my actual near-death experience. She clawed frantically at her own throat, making exaggerated choking and wheezing sounds. She kicked her legs out deliberately, knocking over a heavy dining chair to create maximum noise and disruption. "Help me," she wheezed, reaching a trembling manicured hand out toward Detective Miller, trying to draw his attention away from Ashley. "My chest is closing. I am having a massive heart attack. You cannot arrest my family. I am dying right here on the floor." Ashley screamed even louder, demanding the police release her so she could save her dying mother. Ryan, still sitting at the far end of the table, buried his face entirely in his hands, completely paralyzed by the sheer embarrassment and absolute chaos of the situation. I simply sat at the head of my dining table, picked up a small silver fork, and finally tasted the vanilla bean cake I had baked. It was absolutely delicious. I looked down at my mother writhing on the hardwood floor, and I felt absolutely no panic. I felt no rush of adrenaline. I did not reach for my phone to call an ambulance, because having just survived a real medical emergency, I knew exactly what true suffocation looked like. Real medical terror is silent. Real impending death does not come with a perfectly projected theatrical monologue and carefully coordinated flailing. Detective Miller looked down at Susan with utter professional disgust. He did not rush to her side to offer comfort. He did not shout for someone to bring him a defibrillator. He simply reached up and keyed the radio microphone resting on his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Detective Miller," he said, his voice perfectly calm over the radio static. "We have 2 primary suspects completely secured. Send up the uniformed patrol units waiting in the lobby, and go ahead and roll an emergency medical team to the penthouse. We have a 3rd individual on the floor claiming sudden severe cardiac distress." Detective Miller released the radio button and looked over at me, raising a skeptical eyebrow. "Is she always like this?" he asked casually, gesturing toward my mother, who was still aggressively gasping for air. "Only when she is not the absolute center of attention," I replied, taking another bite of my cake. Heavy tactical boots thundered down the hallway outside my condo. The detective holding my father pulled the front door open, and 4 uniformed patrol officers immediately swarmed into my pristine dining room. The space was instantly transformed from a luxury residential home into an active police holding area. The officers immediately took physical custody of Ashley, who was now weeping loudly. Black expensive mascara was running rapidly down her face and staining her new designer silk dress. They pulled my father away from the door, his custom blazer severely wrinkled and pulled awkwardly around his cuffed wrists. The officers began reading them, their Miranda rights, loudly over the deafening sounds of Susan continuing to fake her dramatic medical crisis on the floor. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead officer yelled, trying to be heard over my mother's fake choking. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I watched the officers drag my father and my sister toward the front door. Ashley dug her heels into the floor, resisting the officers, and locked eyes with me one very last time. She looked at me expecting to see a sudden surge of sisterly guilt. She expected me to break down, cry, and tell the police it was all just a big misunderstanding. I did not break character. I just smiled, gave her a small, completely unsympathetic wave goodbye, and watched the police drag her out into the hallway. They disappeared out of sight, leaving Susan still putting on the performance of an absolute lifetime on my floor, eagerly waiting for her grand medical rescue. Susan continued her ridiculous theatrical performance on my polished hardwood floor for another 3 full minutes. She clutched her chest, making exaggerated choking noises, and rolling her eyes, completely ignoring the fact that the 2 detectives remaining in my dining room were looking at her with absolute sheer boredom. Finally, the heavy steel front door opened again. 2 emergency medical technicians rushed into the condo carrying heavy red trauma bags and a portable defibrillator. I stood up from my chair and immediately recognized the man leading the medical team. It was the exact same tall, broad-shouldered head paramedic who had manually intubated me on my parents' marble floor just 1 week ago. He walked briskly into the dining room, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene before locking directly onto my mother writhing on the floor. He dropped his heavy medical bag next to her and quickly pulled out a blood pressure cuff and a portable heart monitor. Susan saw the official medical equipment and instantly dialed up her performance. She grabbed the paramedic's wrist with a trembling hand, whispering that her heart was completely giving out and she was dying from the extreme stress of watching her family be torn apart. The paramedic did not offer any soothing words. He expertly secured the blood pressure cuff around her arm and attached the sticky electrode pads to her chest under her cashmere wrap. He turned on the monitor. Instead of the chaotic, erratic alarms of a massive cardiac event, the machine let out a slow, steady, rhythmic beep. The paramedic stared at the glowing green screen for several long seconds. Then he reached down and ripped the Velcro cuff right off her arm. He looked my mother dead in the eyes, his expression hardened with absolute professional disgust. "Your heart rate is perfectly normal, Mom," he stated, his voice echoing clearly through the silent room. "Your blood pressure is completely fine, and your oxygen saturation is at 100%. Stop wasting city resources." Susan froze. Her fake choking completely stopped. She looked at the glowing monitor, and then at the furious paramedic, realizing her ultimate manipulation tactic had just failed spectacularly. "Stand up, ma'am," the paramedic ordered, packing his equipment back into the red trauma bag. "There are people in this city actually dying tonight, and you are not one of them." Detective Miller stepped forward and grabbed Susan by the arm, pulling her unceremoniously to her feet. "Your medical emergency is officially over, Susan," the detective announced. "And since you have just been formally served with an eviction notice terminating your legal residency, you are now trespassing on private property. Get out of the apartment." Susan looked at me one last time, her eyes wide with total defeat. The arrogant, demanding matriarch who had controlled my entire life was entirely gone. Without saying a single word, she grabbed her purse and walked out the front door, her head hung low in absolute crushing shame. 2 hours later, I was sitting in a quiet, sterile office at the downtown police precinct. I had just finished giving my official recorded statement to Detective Miller and handed over the 3 meticulously organized binders containing every single piece of financial evidence against my father and sister. The detective closed the thick files and looked at me with profound professional respect. He told me that in his 20 years on the force, he had never seen a victim hand-deliver such a perfectly wrapped, airtight federal prosecution. Before I left, he offered me a rare opportunity. He asked if I wanted to see exactly what happened when a toxic family finally ran out of victims to blame. I followed him down a long, brightly lit hallway until we reached a dark observation room. One entire wall was made of thick, two-way glass, looking directly into 3 separate interrogation rooms. I stood in the darkness and watched the absolute destruction of my family unfold in real time. In the first room, my father sat hunched over a metal table. The arrogant country club president was completely gone. He was aggressively pointing his finger at the detectives, frantically trying to cut a plea deal. The audio piped into the observation room was crystal clear. Richard was throwing my mother completely under the bus. He claimed Susan was the one who demanded they steal the neighborhood funds to support Ashley's failing business. He insisted he was just a helpless husband trying to keep his demanding wife happy, and that he had no idea Ashley was actually laundering the money. In the second room, Ashley was having a complete psychological breakdown. She was sobbing hysterically, her expensive mascara completely ruined, but she was not taking a single ounce of responsibility for her own actions. She was screaming that Susan had explicitly instructed her to inject the walnut oil into my cake. Ashley claimed my mother manipulated her into doing it by promising they would inherit all my money and save her boutique. She was begging the police to arrest her mother for conspiracy instead of her. And in the third room, Susan sat alone, staring blankly at the concrete wall. When the detectives walked in and informed her that both her husband and her beloved golden child had immediately testified against her to save themselves, she completely snapped. She began listing every single illegal financial transaction Richard had ever made, demanding full immunity in exchange for testifying against her own husband and daughter in federal court. I stood behind the thick glass and watched them tear each other to absolute shreds. For 35 years, they had demanded my unwavering loyalty. They had forced me to sacrifice my own happiness, my money, and my peace of mind to keep their toxic family unit completely intact. They constantly preached that family was the most important thing in the world and that blood was thicker than water. But the absolute second they faced real severe consequences, that sacred familial loyalty instantly disintegrated into nothing but pure selfish survival. They were a house of cards built entirely on lies, and the moment the wind blew, they collapsed right on top of each other. I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I did not feel any lingering guilt or regret. I turned away from the two-way glass, thanked Detective Miller for his time and his hard work, and walked out of the observation room. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors of the police precinct and stepped out into the cool night air. The city streets were quiet, the distant sounds of traffic humming softly in the background. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air. For the first time in my entire life, I was not carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of my parents' expectations or my sister's endless mistakes. The invisible chains that had kept me tied to their endless cycle of financial and emotional abuse were completely shattered. I hailed a private car to take me back to my luxury condominium. I watched the city lights blur past the window, feeling a profound, absolute sense of peace. I was completely weightless. Exactly 1 year later, the morning sun poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my brand-new sunroom. I had sold my downtown luxury condominium a few months after the arrests. While I loved the high security of that building, the dining room held too many dark memories of my toxic family standing over my glass table, demanding my entire life savings. I wanted a completely fresh start. So I purchased a stunning historic townhouse in a quiet, affluent neighborhood entirely with my own clean, heavily audited money. I spent the last 6 months renovating the property, turning the back patio into a gorgeous glass-enclosed sunroom filled with lush green plants and comfortable linen furniture. It was my sanctuary, a physical manifestation of the absolute peace I had finally achieved. The physical healing from my severe allergic reaction had taken a few weeks, but the emotional liberation I felt after walking out of that police precinct had completely transformed my life. I was thriving in a way I had never thought possible. Stripped of the massive financial burden of secretly funding my parents' lavish country club lifestyle and my sister's failing retail business, my personal wealth had grown exponentially. But the most significant change happened in my professional life. My corporate bosses had kept every single promise they made in that executive boardroom. Once the independent forensic audit proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my financial records were completely spotless, the managing partner personally called me into his office. He did not just restore my network access. He formally offered me a senior partnership at the firm. I now have my own dedicated team of junior accountants, a massive corner office with a panoramic view of the city skyline, and my name permanently etched onto the frosted glass of the executive double doors. I spent my entire life being treated like a disposable walking automated teller machine by the people who raised me. Now I am recognized as one of the top financial investigators in the corporate sector, and my expertise is valued at the highest possible level. The soft, cheerful chime of my front doorbell echoed through the quiet townhouse, breaking my reflection. I smiled, setting down my coffee mug, and walked down the hallway to open the heavy oak door. Kendra stood on my front porch, holding a chilled bottle of incredibly expensive imported champagne and a bouquet of vibrant yellow sunflowers. She looked absolutely radiant. The deep exhaustion and constant anxiety that used to permanently shadow her face when she was married to my brother was completely gone. Kendra had finalized her divorce from Ryan 8 months ago. She walked away from that toxic marriage without asking for a single penny of their dirty money. Instead, she channeled all of her fierce intelligence and unstoppable drive into launching her own independent corporate consulting firm. Within her very first year of business, she had already secured several massive contracts with Fortune 500 companies. She was building her own empire completely free from the suffocating weight of my cowed brother and his manipulative parents. "Come in," I smiled, stepping aside to let her into the bright entryway. "You look amazing, Kendra." She pulled me into a tight, genuine hug. "And you look like a woman who finally owns her entire life." She laughed, handing me the champagne and the flowers. "I brought the good stuff today. We have a lot to celebrate." We walked back into the sunroom. I had spent the entire morning preparing a massive Sunday brunch. The rustic wooden table was covered in fresh fruit, artisanal cheeses, imported cured meats, and a towering stack of warm homemade waffles. And unlike the lavish catered parties my parents used to throw, there was absolutely no fear or anxiety attached to the food. I did not have to worry about someone sneaking into my kitchen to poison me. I did not have to hide my purse or guard my credit cards. Every single thing in this house was safe because I had built an impenetrable fortress around my life, and I held the only key. I popped the cork on the champagne and poured the sparkling wine into two tall crystal flutes, topping them off with fresh orange juice. I handed a glass to Kendra, and we sat down across from each other, soaking in the warm morning sunlight. We looked at each other, and we did not need to speak about the horrific events of the past year. We did not need to talk about the screaming or the handcuffs or the suffocating marble floor. We had both walked through absolute hell side by side, and we had both come out on the other side, completely victorious. We had forged a bond that was stronger than any biological connection. We were no longer just former sisters-in-law. We had become chosen family. We chose to protect each other. We chose to respect each other. And we chose to demand better for our own lives. Kendra raised her crystal flute, the morning light catching the rising bubbles in the glass. To peace, she proposed, her voice filled with profound gratitude and strength. To strict, unapologetic boundaries, and to officially cutting out the toxic cancer that tried to drag us down. To chosen family, I agreed, raising my glass to meet hers. The crystal flutes clinked together with a bright, clear ring that echoed beautifully through the sunroom. We spent the next 3 hours eating, laughing, and talking about our future business plans. We talked about upcoming vacations we wanted to take together and the new clients we were onboarding at our respective firms. There was no drama. There was no manipulation. There was just the pure, unadulterated joy of two independent women who had fought incredibly hard to reclaim their own autonomy. Sitting there in the warmth of my new home, I realized that my father had always been wrong. He always preached that family was an unshakable biological obligation. He believed that sharing a last name meant you had to tolerate endless abuse and sacrifice your own happiness to protect the toxic status quo. But he was completely wrong. Family is not defined by blood or legal documents. True family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering support, and the consistent daily choice to bring peace into each other's lives instead of destruction. I had to lose my entire biological family to finally understand that truth. But looking across the table at Kendra, I knew with absolute certainty that the painful trade was worth it. I finally had a real family. After Kendra left that afternoon, I spent some time cleaning up the sunroom, feeling a lingering warmth from our conversation. I gathered the empty crystal champagne flutes and wiped down the rustic wooden table. I decided to walk down to the secure mailroom in the lobby of my townhouse community to collect the weekend's deliveries. Among the glossy financial magazines and standard utility bills was a flimsy plain white envelope. It was stamped with the unmistakable heavy black ink seal of the State Women's Correctional Facility. The return address belonged to Ashley. My sister was currently serving the first year of a mandatory 5-year federal sentence for aggravated assault and reckless endangerment. I opened the envelope, holding the cheap lined paper up to the sunlight pouring through the lobby windows. The messy, frantic handwriting was immediately recognizable. I scanned the very first sentence. She was begging me to put $500 into her prison commissary account, complaining bitterly that the generic shampoo was ruining her hair and that the other inmates were being mean to her. She even had the absolute audacity to suggest that since she was blood, I owed her this small favor. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt. I did not read the second sentence. I walked back upstairs to my home office and pressed the power button on my heavy-duty cross-cut paper shredder. The machine roared to life. I fed the letter directly into the metal teeth, watching the desperate manipulative words be instantly shredded into thousands of tiny, unreadable confetti strips. The mechanical grinding sound was incredibly satisfying. Ashley was not the only one paying a severe and permanent price for her greed. My father had narrowly avoided a massive federal prison sentence by accepting a devastating plea deal where he admitted complete guilt and agreed to pay full financial restitution to the Homeowners Association. But that restitution completely bankrupted him. The federal government seized all of his remaining assets. Stripped of his pristine country club membership, his expensive tailored suits, and his bloated pride, Richard was forced to move into a dingy weekly rate motel on the desolate outskirts of the city. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that he now drives a rusted 15-year-old sedan and spends his days hiding in his cheap room dodging angry phone calls from the various shady investors he still owes money. The man who once looked down on everyone else from his imported Italian tile foyer now sleeps on a lumpy mattress that smells like stale cigarette smoke. And Susan suffered perhaps the most perfectly poetic justice of all. When the local sheriff's department officially enforced my eviction notice, she was forced to pack her designer cashmere sweaters and pearl necklaces into black plastic garbage bags. Stripped of her socialite status and drowning in the massive legal debts her husband had accumulated, my mother was forced to actually enter the workforce for the first time in 40 years. She now works the customer service return desk at a massive discount retail store. She spends 8 hours a day standing on her feet wearing a cheap polyester vest getting yelled at by angry, impatient shoppers for minimum wage. Every single one of her meager paychecks is aggressively garnished by the state court to pay off their mounting legal fees. The woman who used to sit at elite charity luncheons, criticizing the waitstaff, is now forced to smile and apologize to angry strangers just to afford her groceries. Even my brother Ryan had to face the cold, harsh reality of his own cowardice. After Kendra handed him those divorce papers, he completely fell apart. He eventually moved 2 states away, taking a mediocre entry-level desk job. He lives entirely alone, still trying to figure out who he actually is without his fierce wife to protect him, and without his manipulative parents pulling his strings. As I sat down at my glass desk looking out over the beautiful, peaceful neighborhood I had chosen for myself, I realized that the nightmare was truly and permanently over. The physical scars on my throat had faded away months ago, but the emotional armor I had forged during that terrifying week would protect me for the rest of my life. I had taken the absolute worst betrayal imaginable and turned it into the foundation of my ultimate freedom. If you are listening to my story right now, and you are currently trapped in a toxic family dynamic, I need you to hear this very clearly. Family is not blood, it is respect. Never let anyone convince you that your boundaries are a betrayal. You do not owe your life, your sanity, or your hard-earned success to people who treat you like a disposable resource. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to legally and entirely walk away from the people who are committed to misunderstanding your worth. Have you ever had to draw a hard legal line in the sand and permanently cut off a toxic relative to save yourself? How did you finally take your absolute power back from the people who tried to tear you down? I would love to read your stories of survival and independence in the comments section below. If my journey resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories about surviving toxic families and reclaiming your independence. Share this video with someone who might be struggling right now and needs a harsh but necessary reminder that they are entirely allowed to walk away from their abusers. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that the best revenge is always living a beautiful, successful, and completely peaceful life without them.